Now I'll tell you a little bit about what we think we would like to see happen in all of the communities that are part of the Pacific Northwest Brain Tumor Alliance. It's certainly happening here in Everett. It's certainly happening in Seattle. What it is it's an integrated approach to patient care, and it consists of 4 components. One is a multidisciplinary clinic where all of the doctors are in one place and the patient can go there to have a single appointment in which all the doctors are present and can help them treat and deal with their disease. These doctors will have met already in a tumor board, so they've already discussed the patient's images as well as the treatment plan. So there's minimal delay in bringing treatment and treatment options to the patient. That to me seems to be quite simple, and turns out it's not quite simple to do, but again, Everett's done an excellent job at putting that into place. Second component is this idea of clinical trials. When you are facing a disease which is fatal, with no cure, rapidly progressing in 1 or 2 years, clearly the state-of-the-art of medical care is not acceptable to you or to your family. Clinical trials offer hope. They offer access to new treatments that currently aren't available except under the protocols of a clinical trial. Most clinical trials today require that we understand a little bit more about the patients and their disease. Let me tell you, just as a digression, a little bit about that. If you take a look at cancer treatments today, what strikes you about today versus 20 years ago is that today the treatments are targeted. They are targeted specifically at a patient's tumor. And let me define what that means. If you look under a microscope at brain cancer across all patients, it looks surprisingly the same across all patients. And yet we know when we treat those patients that some patients will do better than others. Why is that? Because if you look under the microscope, you're just looking at the cells that make up the tumor, and frankly they all look alike, sort of like looking down at a football stadium with a bunch of people and they all look kind of alike from a distance. But when you look closer at these cells, and by closer I mean when you look at the molecules that make up the cells, and particularly at the genes that are expressed in the cells, then you see that there are significant differences between patients. Most clinical trials today, when they design the trial, they try to figure out in some way how can we separate out patients based on gene expression. Now, genes are basically little switches. You can think of them as switches. A gene's either on or off in a tumor cell. And what we know about cancer is that genes have a significant influence on cancer. And whether or not a gene is turned on or off can make the difference between whether a cancer is going to grow or not. There are about 30,000 genes that are in a patient's genome, and in a cancer cell there's about 20,000 that have either been turned on or off. So understanding whether genes are turned or off is clearly a key at understanding which patients will respond or won't respond to a particular therapy. Well, understanding that as background, clearly if you're going to offer clinical trials, you need to have some capacity to measure gene expression in the patients. Because again, you want to be able to know whether a patient's going to respond or not. And you also want to interpret the results of your trial to see whether or not the treatment worked and why it worked. What we do through the Alliance is we offer this capability out to all of the participants in the Alliance so that you can be a doctor in Bellingham or in Everett or in Spokane or in Seattle for that matter and participate in the trial because we can provide that ability to understand gene expression in the tumor in a centralized facility. So what we're doing, in essence, is by grouping together and working together, is we are bringing state-of-the-art clinical trials to the Pacific Northwest. These are the same clinical trials that you would get if you went to one of these big brain tumor centers. We can do that because alone, none of us have the resources to be able to do this. But by working together, then we have the resources that allow us to do this. Now, most of my patients, when they hear about clinical trials, are interested. In fact, I've never had a patient who did not say that they wouldn't do anything they could to save their life. But the bottom line is that when it comes right down to enrolling in a clinical trial, if it's not available in your own community, it's pretty hard to do I take care of about 100 patients with brain cancer, newly diagnosed each year. There's about 200 that are under my care. Only about 1% of them actually have the ability to get up and travel across the country to be part of a clinical trial. All of them, however, would like to be a part of a clinical trial if possible. Clearly, by offering them in the community, we are doing a great service to these patients. And clearly, by recognizing that no one institution can do it by themselves, only by working together, that is the solution. Now, the third component of cancer care that we think is important in the community is what we call integrative care. Stop for a second to tell you a little bit about what these patients experience. You know, the actual medical side of taking care of brain cancer is fairly straightforward. I can usually cover that in an hour or two of discussion with a patient and the family. It's routine. Once you understand it and understand what needs to be done, it's very straightforward and easy to understand. But there's a whole nother element to this disease which is not so easy to understand. You know, this idea of how to deal with communicating that you have cancer with your family or with your employer or with your friends. How to deal with insurance companies. How to deal with disability, if that's what's occurred. How to deal with the emotional, psychological aspects of having cancer, of hopefully having remission, and hopefully even someday being a survivor. These are all very important, deeply personal issues that transcend the traditional model of what a medical doctor provides. Yet we think it's equally important. In fact, I have two criteria. Everything that crosses my desk has to meet one of these two criteria to become a part of the Alliance programs. Number one, it has to in some way improve survival. Number two, it has to in some way improve quality of life. Well, integrative care is a big factor in improving quality of life. Right now, every patient has my cell phone number, and they have that because I want them to call me if they have a question, a concern, if they have a fear. Most of these calls that I get are not medical. Most of these calls I get relate to something personal, usually something deeply personal related to their family, related to their job, life-changing issues that they need help with. Now, I'm happy to take those calls, and in fact, I want to take those calls, but I'm not always available because I'm just one person, and I operate, and I see patients, and I do other things, and my cell phone rings many times when I'm in the OR, and I can't answer it. By having an integrative care coordinator, someone who is available to answer all of these questions that relate to brain cancer and yet fall outside of the traditional medical routine, is vitally important to these patients. And we envision having an integrative care coordinator in every one of our community centers. These integrative care coordinators will allow us to study quality of life, to understand what makes a difference for these patients. And again, I tell every one of my patients, quality of life improves survival. Now, we don't have a lot of proof for that, but imagine when you're under stress, when you're suffering anxiety, when you're fearful. Imagine what's happening to your health. We know that the immune system is suppressed by these sorts of negative emotional feelings. And you need that immune system to stay strong and to fight cancer. So that's just one example. I think it transcends that. If you're in a difficult chemotherapy regimen and you're wondering whether it's worth it or not, your emotional state is vitally important to your survival, to your strength, to your ability to continue with your medical therapy. We think these things are important, and we think they're equally important to what we do with clinical trials, what we do with genomic science, what I do in the operating room. And we think it's so important that it's one of the key features of these community centers. And finally, it's the community outreach, the fourth component, the Pacific Northwest Brain Tumor Alliance, the idea that any one center might see 20 to 30 of these patients a year. So alone, we can make very little difference. But together, grouped together across the state, now we're talking about 500 or 600 patients. Now, if we see 500 or 600 patients a year as a group and are able to study them as a group and offer clinical trials, we become one of the major brain cancer centers in the country. Imagine that. Well, that's what we should be. It's the Pacific Northwest. This is the region that has the University of Washington, the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center, Swedish Hospital, Providence Everett Medical Center, the Province Regional Cancer Partnership, all of these wonderful biotechnology institutions, we should be one of the number one places to go for brain cancer treatment in the country.